Tēnā tātou katoa. Welcome to Raw Politics, a podcast where we distill some of the biggest political issues for the week and hopefully leave you with a little something to think about looking forwards. I am joined by the usual crew. In Wellington, I have with me senior political reporter Marc Daalder, and joining us in Auckland is Newsroom co-editor Tim Murphy, and I am political editor Laura Walters. Now, before we dig into this week's topics, I just wanted to ask you two whether you feel like this week has been a bit more relaxed. I remember last week on the pod we were saying that things were kind of coming thick and fast in the world of politics. This week has been a recess, and it has been so nice to have the politicians out of Wellington. I think we've had Christopher Luxon overseas. Of course, we have had a lot of people up at Turangawaewae in Ngāruawāhia for Kiingi Tuheitia's funeral. Is it just me? Have I not been working hard enough, or has it felt a little bit more chill this week?
I think it has been quieter. Luxon being away helps. Winston presumably tasked with rereading IPCC reports after last week, so he's just been working through that, makes him a bit quieter. Shane Jones, I believe, had his birthday, his Super Gold Card birthday recently, though. So
big 6'5".
Presumably that's where everyone else was at the big bash. Needless to say, plenty of seafood there, and not heated by electric heat pumps.
How about for you in Auckland, Tim?
Hasn't it been a lovely contrast from the weeks ahead of that, with all that politicking, to see at Turangawaewae a sort of a continuum, things that go on and last and are passed on, rather than the flip-flopping between governments that we have as our norm in Wellington, and that the conflict and the point scoring and all the sort of things that we criticise about our political system. Down on the marae for the Tangi, you've seen some dignity and some heritage and some depth and, class all round, really, that I think obviously goes above and beyond politics. And even when the politicians have been there, it's sort of drawn them upwards.
Yeah, absolutely. And we've got probably, a couple more days to enjoy this before things return to the norm in Wellington with a sitting week next week. So today on Raw Politics, our three big topics are the politics surrounding the government delegation's trip to Kiingi Tuheitia's Tangi, as you have mentioned, Tim, Simeon Brown's $32.9 billion plan to build roads, and Te Whatu Ora's really bizarre toast ban and then backtrack. And as always, we will finish up with some recommendations. A week on from the death of Kiingi Tuheitia, the Māori king, he has been laid to rest. And shortly before we sat down to record this podcast, his daughter, Nga Wai Hono i te po, was named as his successor. This is all happening at a crucial time for Māori Crown relations, and all eyes will be on the new Queen to see how she will make her mark and how she will take Te Ao Māori forwards. Tim, I'm interested in your thoughts on all of this. You've obviously been watching the streams, the constant live streams of Tuheitia's Tangi playing throughout the week. He has been described by so many as a quiet and dignified, perhaps less fiery or outspoken person than his mother was. But that seems to have changed recently, at least from what I have seen. He's been kind of leading the conversation around Crown Māori relations, and we'll remember earlier in the year in the summer when he called it a national hui, which is quite a rare thing to happen, to essentially counter a lot of the government's policies. What do you think has been driving him forwards, and I guess what his legacy, especially in terms of kind of the more recent discussions and where we're sitting at the moment with Crown Māori relations?
Yeah, he's certainly transformed in terms of his external and political presence over those 18 years. I noted Hono Harawira, former Mana Party and Te Māori Party MP who was a classmate of his at Hatotipini St Stephen's School, speaking at the Tangi, saying that in the last few years he had really come into his own, Tuheitia, and had started to become a more direct and more kind of demanding leader, perhaps. That's a long time in the formation, 18 years, and probably in the last 6 or 7, we've seen this political outreach more by him. Remember, in 2017, he backed his advisor, who's been prominent this week, Rahui Papa, as the Māori Party candidate against the King's cousin, Nanaia Mahuta, for Labour, for the seat, largely because I think Tuheitia said that he thought that Labour had marginalised her and that had reduced her mana. But that was a very, very major political stance that not only did he challenge Labour then, but then plainly, as you say, with the hui this year that he called in the face of the coalition centre-right parties' policies, just drawing a line and challenging there as well. Now, much has been made, and you wrote of this for Newsroom, Laura, about him being viewed this week as the king of kotahitanga, of unity. His most recent speech at the Koronahana, his coronation celebration, was unity. And so while he's been making stances both against Labour and against National Act New Zealand First, he's now and has been calling for unity, primarily, I think, in Māoridom's response to these political parties and their policies, but also for the nation and for the political cause ongoing.
Mm-hmm. And interesting what you picked up on there from Hone Harawira, in terms of that, him really coming into his own. We've got to remember he's only 69. It would be fair that he would just be hitting his stride then, and that he would expect to have more time in that position to make his mark and leave a legacy. So it's a life cut short. I'm also interested to pick up on the point around the switch in support from Labour to Te Pāti Māori. We saw the Te Pāti Māori local MP, Hana Rafiti Maipi Clark, there at the Tangi. She was emceeing the celebrations last night when they had big names like Stan Walker and things performing. She's been, a figure there, kind of behind the scenes for this past week. I'm just interested what you think, Marc, in terms of that significance of the Kiingitanga switching their support to Te Pāti Māori in recent years, and why you think that that party and that movement align.
Yeah, I think probably it has a lot less to do with manifesto and specific policy and more, like a lot of things in Māori politics and the Māori seats in particular, with people and their connections with one another. Obviously Nanaia Mahuta having that personal connection to the king, but no longer being Labour's candidate, having lost the seat in last year's election. And even just that act of Nanaia Mahuta, someone with who's the Foreign Affairs Minister, who took a lot of the heat on Three Waters because of the co-governance issue in particular, but also was quite kind of steadfast in that process, still losing that seat to Hana. It just shows, actually where the support was within, the rohe of the Kiingitanga, and it wasn't with Labour, at least in that area. And I don't think that there's a poisoned relationship between Labour and the Kiingitanga. Pini Henare, a Labour MP, is one of the members of the Te Kau Marua, the 12 people who kind of have selected the new queen. So that's still, those connections are still strong. I think it tends to be a lot more in an individual race or on an individual issue where things might align. But I think it would be fair to say, broadly, that the Kiingitanga has got more political, more partisan, not on one side or another, Labour or Te Pāti Māori necessarily. That can change, but wading into issues in a way that they might not have, like Tim was saying a little while ago.
Do you think that, because we've talked about this before on the podcast, where Te Pāti Māori is less apologetic, they're and more activist and happy to just lay it all out there, where Labour, as one of those big legacy parties, might, kind of play the politics more, say the things that they feel like need to be said behind closed doors, but temper their language out in public. Do you feel like that has anything to do with it, that the Kiingitanga movement is also becoming less apologetic, less about quiet politics and more about, just standing up and openly saying what they think and what they want?
Tim?
Oh, well, one of the things we might see is that the new Queen may well be even more sharper in terms of her commentary and her views. I noticed in a piece I was reading about her today that when she went to the UK and met the King, Charles, one of the emotions she expressed, not to him, I don't think, but in media afterwards, was that she felt angry going to the UK, seeing this land, this well-resourced, wealthy, rich country, and thinking, why did they have to come down and colonise and take Māori resource and take over Aotearoa New Zealand? Which was fascinating. And she said, I think I have a right to be angry. I am angry. Now, that was then, and this is now. She's now the monarch of the Kiingitanga. So you have to have a different approach, I imagine, with different advisors and maybe some more constraints. But, this is someone who feels it deeply and will wear that history and the obligation and probably be inspired by her father's most recent political kind of sallies into the general discourse.
I think that you read that piece, Tim, in the Newsroom Pro editorial this morning from Jonathan Milne.
Well-researched Jonathan,
yeah. I do think, I wouldn't say necessarily that the King has been or had been on exactly the same page in terms of his approach to these issues as Te Pāti Māori. It did feel like, he was one of the heads of kind of united Māori opposition to the government's policies, but in a somewhat collaborative approach of like, let us work with you on this, as opposed to, I think, Te Pāti Māori would not frame it in quite that way. So exactly where the new Queen ends up on that kind of spectrum from, we oppose what you're doing, but I think we can work together to improve it, to we oppose what you're doing and we will stop you from doing it. There's overlap within those things, but where she ends up on that spectrum will be interesting to see.
How much of that belief in kotahitanga as it relates to the Crown and Māori relations will be interesting. And I think we can't not cover what we saw on Wednesday at Turangawaewae with the politicians, from all different parties from across the spectrum coming and speaking on the paepae and how that was received. I was really struck by the difference in what we saw between Koronehana just over 2 weeks ago, and then what we saw on Wednesday, where it was so fiery and it was so political at the coronation event, whereas it was promised that all politics would be put aside for the Tangi, and that is fitting. But I think there was just enough of a hint at politics to remind those there, especially the government ministers, David Seymour, who, was there, his first visit to Turangawaewae, just enough there to make it a little bit awkward, just as awkward as it needed to be, and just remind them that this conversation isn't over. We're putting this to the side for one day or for, this week, but there are conversations that are going to keep happening and we will continue to challenge you. I thought that difference was quite interesting. I also thought good on Seymour for fronting up and speaking. I mean, Shane Jones we saw speak on behalf of government ministers, and I was frantically texting Seymour's team in the morning. Is he going to have a speaking slot? Is he not? What's he going to say? And initially it was no, and then it was actually yes. And he stood up there and he walked out. There's no hiding on the paepaes out there in front of everyone, really exposed. And someone who doesn't have a strong command of te reo Māori, and he acknowledged that, he still attempted to, read his speech in Te Reo and kind of very nervously, very slowly kind of stumbled or stepped his way through that. But that was really appreciated and acknowledged, not the celebration of perfection, but the celebration of someone who's actually willing to front up and give it a go. And I must say, for us, here in the gallery, we don't usually see that version of David Seymour. We see someone with a lot of confidence in the halls of Parliament when he's met with a situation that he's not wholly comfortable with. He uses a quip or a bit of bluster, or he references some kind of niche bit of libertarian academia to, move his way through and onto the next topic. But he wasn't able to do that on Wednesday. And I think him being humbled and vulnerable in that moment was really interesting to watch. I guess the last question is, and we covered some of this at the beginning, but do the politicians actually listen? Does all of this discussion about kotahitanga go, as you said, Tim, beyond this moment, beyond this day? It's easy enough to say it when they're remembering Kiingi Tuheitia's legacy and, marking his life and his death, but will they now live up to that? What do you think, Marc?
I wouldn't expect to see any policy changes, just because, a lot of it is just politics, right? And so nothing here has changed David Seymour's commitment to the Treaty Principles Bill. Nothing here has changed Paul Goldsmith's and New Zealand First's, desire to change the Marine and Coastal Areas Act. That stuff is still going to happen, or at least happen as much as, has been promised in the coalition agreements. But maybe there's an opportunity for better consultation and engagement for just trying to repair a relationship. Although it's tough, right? How do you have a relationship where you say, yes, we're going to do all these things that are potentially quite harmful to you. No, we won't stop doing them, but we will listen to you. Is that the foundation of a healthy relationship? Probably not.
Transport Minister Simeon Brown wants to build lots of roads, and he wants to fill lots of potholes as well, but he definitely does not want more bike lanes. Now, we've got a lot to cover, and we're going to cover it quickly because we don't have heaps of time left on the pod. But Simeon Brown would like that because he's also a big fan of raising speed limits. This week, Brown gave a big announcement about the government's new land transport plan. Kind of the headline bits or the highlights are that he's spending $32.9 billion on this new plan, and some of the big ticket items are bringing back the roads of national significance, 17 of them, I think, setting up his pothole prevention fund, shifting the road maintenance fund to a pothole prevention fund. There's also going to be some public transport for the main centres. And then more broadly, this kind of what the government likes to call their back to basics approach, which they've used across lots of different policy areas. But back to basics for Simeon Brown means no more cycleways and no more speed bumps or speed humps. Now, Marc, it seems that the big hole in this plan is the lack of funding for cycleways. That was the angle that was kind of picked up by a lot of media on the day that announcement dropped. Why do you think that there is that lack of funding for cycleways, and why do people get so passionate on this issue?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, right? Because we say it's the big hole in the plan, but realistically, cycleways were only ever 1% of the national transport budget. So, Simeon Brown coming out and saying people are sick of all this money being spent on cycleways. You can have an argument about that, but let's not pretend that if you hadn't funded those cycleways, you'd be able to get an extra lane on the Otaki to Levin expressway. No, that's going to be 5 New Zealand's worth of cycleways.
Yeah, it's not going to build that big tunnel that we've been talking about.
No, the big hole, and so. That's part of it in terms of what this has is it doesn't have any funding for any new active transport. So that's cycleways and walking. And so basically sort of pedestrianization of areas. It does continue some funding to finish off projects that were already committed to and, ongoing under previous transport plans. Why do people get so upset? I don't know. Maybe I think people just don't have that sense of the proportion, right? They hear a lot about cycleways. Journalists write a lot about them.
Yeah.
Politicians talk a lot about them.
It's just an easy target.
You get this like sense that, based on reading, Facebook comments in your local neighborhood groups, which is not necessarily representative of the population.
Yeah, the Island Bay Facebook page. Oh my goodness, those cycleways.
and you get the sense that people think if we just defunded the cycleways, that money could fill every pothole in Wellington, fix every pipe in Wellington, add 3 new libraries, fix the town hall, fix the Reading Cinema. It's like, no, it's really not a lot of money. But it does get this disproportionate kind of reaction to it.
So the comms are bad, and potentially the rollout of cycleways to date haven't been amazing. It's been kind of disjointed, and people haven't had a great user experience with it. I guess.
Think early cycleways like the Island Bay one weren't very, well thought through. Then local councils have sometimes attempted to build these cycling networks. There's this big ambitious plan for a cycling network in Wellington, but then the backlash against that means that they chop it all up and only keep little bits, and then you have, you're on a cycleway, then you're on a road, then you're on a cycleway again to get into town, and then they're like, why are these cycleways here? They're useless. Well, they're useless because you made them useless.
Yeah. So better planning and implementation needed there, and also the comms around it. Now, you say that cutting that cycleways budget wouldn't pay to, for all these things, including filling in the potholes. Sorry, I have an idea for Simeon Brown. I reckon he takes the speed bumps and the speed humps that he hates so much, and he uses that to fill in the potholes.
Or he could take the road cones from Auckland, and it's a sort of brown team up, fill the potholes with road cones. Everyone's happy, right?
Fixed. On a more serious note on that topic, though, Tim, I mean, potholes, speed humps, speed limit increases. Why is Simeon Brown and this government so obsessed with these? Does it actually make any difference, as they claim, to the economy if they can kind of speed people up? And I guess the flip side of that is, what's the impact on safety?
This package, this policy announcement, had more spin than one of those night meetings in the Waikato of boy races at some farm intersection. Honestly, there was so much rubbish talked, and one of them is the pothole fund, which, as we say, most of that money was being used to maintain roads. Now it's being named a pothole fund. The speed limit thing, taking up some highways from 100 to 110, the justification being that there could be improvement to productivity. Our colleague David Williams in Christchurch looked at the southern motorway down there and analysed it with a former Ministry of Transport science advisor who said, look, there might be a few seconds that you gain overall in the 22 Ks, maybe a minute. But that the theory, the economics and the social kind of analysis is that the people who save that up to a minute in their driving don't get more productive and start working at their desk or their machine or their office, that they just spend more time scrolling their phone when they get there. This is just the sort of spin upon spin upon spin. I think they could be just straight up and honest and say, we think these highways, these new ones, are well enough made to support a higher speed. They could say that we're removing speed humps, speed bumps outside schools or around roads because our people, our voters, are irritated and impatient. And these things are slowing everyone down. They're annoying people, and annoyance isn't what we want. We don't want our voters annoyed. We want them serene and happy and listening to their music and talk back and sort of, cheering on this national coalition. There's so much nonsense talked. The savings from speed bumps and speed humps, a lot of the analysis is done on what were the most expensive ones that were put in certain places that were over-engineered, possibly because they're also engineering water and gas and power lines underneath and all this other stuff. And so that's extrapolated out to say, well, look, this is sort of bringing the country's transport economy and the economy and our productivity to our knees. There's some minor changes that make a bit of sense if you're just honest and say, these things are slowing us down. People don't like them. We're here to give people what they like.
Yeah. And there's a, just on your point around speed humps and speed bumps, there's a great story as well on Newsroom this week from our colleague Jono Milne, who has written about National MP Tim Costley advocating for a speed hump outside his local school, only now having to backtrack to get in line quickly with the government position. Now to our audience question for this week. Was Wellington Hospital really going to cut toast and tea for new mums, or was that just a Washington Monument tactic from bureaucrats looking to embarrass the government? Now, Tim, before we head forward with this question, can you please explain to us the Washington Monument tactic? What does that mean?
It's just a famous episode in US congressional budgets, where Congress had said we need to cut budgets by X, Y, and Z, and it went across departments, including the Parks Department. The Parks Department looks after monuments nationally. The chief of the Parks Department thought, well, okay then, if you're requiring this untenable amount from my department, how about we close access to the Washington Monument, which threw the Congress and all the members and representatives into a bit of a spin, realising that their constituents wouldn't go for this, that this is something we couldn't sustain. It was dropped, the money was retained. But it's taken as a symbolic thing to say, if you don't want to give up something's being demanded of you, you put forward the most unpalatable, ridiculous almost spending. And my response to our questioner is that this is exactly that example.
Do you reckon? So I would like to think so, but considering some of the things that have come out of Te Whatu Ora recently that, Newsroom has reported on around where cuts might happen, and including suggestions that it could happen at the front line when, the Commissioner Lester Levy is saying absolutely not, that is wrong, we will not be having cuts there. I sometimes do wonder whether there are people at those higher levels that are a bit out of touch. We'd almost have to see who sent the emails and the tone of them to get an idea about it. What do you reckon, Marc?
Yeah, I think it's hard to say, right? It is a risky strategy for officials to do because there's a world in which the government just looks back and says, yep, cut it, right? If you cut things that you think are really important for your patients in the hopes that will force the government to back down, they might not.
Calling their bluff is a risky tactic,
you're
saying.
Because they might not be bluffing.
I mean, a personal reflection, I remember getting toast, and it was Milo, not tea, at Wellington Hospital after giving birth to my daughter. And I think it had been something like over 20 hours since I had last eaten. And it was so welcome in that moment. When I saw the story or the suggestion that it would be cut, I couldn't believe it. So it was good to hear that they backtracked on that. And if it's not, to our readers' point or our audience members' point, a Washington Monument tactic, then you think that it's got to be a ridiculous, short-sighted measure for pretty minimal savings.
If you're really looking for savings, you can cut funding to the ambulances because you don't need as many of them now that they can go so much faster.
Let's wrap things up with some recommendations, something you watched, read, or listened to this week that you've enjoyed. Tim, let's start with you.
Mine's one from RNZ, from the digital journalist Russell Palmer, who revealed that the government's in-depth considered communication with the government of Korea ahead of cancelling the Cook Strait ferries deal consisted of 2 late text messages.
Cool. How about you, Marc?
I'm recommending a piece just from late last week from Foxmeyer at Newsroom. Big scoop on the draft version of the fast track bill that New Zealand first took into coalition negotiations and the 4 mines that were on the special projects list.
Yeah, a really good scoop there. Mine this week is an episode of the Working Group podcast. Now, it has mysteriously disappeared from online. There is a write-up of it from Martin Bradbury, but essentially in this podcast episode, a former National Party person, now columnist, Matthew Hooton, absolutely unleashes on Don Brash and Hobson's pledge. He holds nothing back. And if you can find that episode, it's well worth a listen. That is it from Raw Politics for this week. Thank you so much to our producer, Trent Doyle, and to all of our readers, listeners and viewers. If you have any burning questions, send them my way. My email address is laura.walters@newsroom.co.nz. You can find us next week here on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts.